Hey guys, tonight we're slipping beneath the covers, but not before you put on your Victorian nightclothes, all 5 layers of them. You're not just here for sleep, you're stepping into a world where bedtime fashion is judged as harshly as Sunday church wear, where what touches your skin at midnight could mean the difference between virtue and vice. And trust me, those itchy flannel drawers you're holding, they're the softest part of tonight's outfit. You won't believe this, but Victorians didn't just dress for the day, they dressed for the dark. Forget silky slips or breezy cotton. You reach for a thick, undyed wool shirt that feels like it's been soaked in thistle. The sleeves are loose, the cuffs enormous, and there's no tag, because there's no brand. It's homemade or stitched by a weary seamstress under gaslight, probably from a coarse bolt of flannel sold by the yard at Smithfield Market. You pull it over your head and instantly regret it. It clings in all the wrong places. The neckline scratches your collarbone, the seams dig into your underarms, and the smell. A musty mix of coal smoke and soap that never quite rinses out. This isn't for comfort. It's for survival. Victorian homes, especially the ones you can afford, aren't exactly cosy. No central heating, no insulation, just a tiny grate, a pile of coal you were lucky to afford this week, and windows that let in more breeze than they keep out, which explains why your nightshirt is barely distinguishable from your day shirt, just longer, rougher, and a few decades behind in fashion. The flannel isn't soft, it's function. And then come the drawers, long, heavy, high-waisted. They button awkwardly at the side, and there's a flap at the back in case nature calls. You tie them on with a cord. No elastic here. Rubber's still a luxury, and elasticated waistbands. That's 20th century magic. Tonight, it's twine and hope. Now you layer up. Another undershirt, this one tighter, made of brushed wool, advertised in the ladies' newspaper as the ideal remedy for chills, neuralgia, and melancholy. Melancholy? Yes, your underwear is supposed to fix your mood. The Victorians truly believed that flannel next to the skin could prevent disease, improve digestion, and even ward off sin. At this point you're already sweating, because oddly, Victorian bedrooms were freezing but their sleepwear was suffocating. Some wore as many as 3 layers to bed. Undershirt, long flannel nightshirt and a wrapper, basically a belted overcoat, often quilted or padded. It's like dressing for a hike through a snowstorm just to crawl into bed. Your grandmother insists that sleeping without wool is an invitation to death. She once told you about a cousin who slept bare-armed and caught consumption before dawn. You didn't ask questions. The story lives on, as do her knitted wool mittens, which she insists you wear even indoors. Even your socks are made of boiled wool. You slip them on and feel your toes curl in protest. They're thick, loose, and already damp from being dried by the hearth. One sock is clearly older than the other. You think it might have been made for someone else's foot entirely, but there's no turning back now. The garments have been aired, the layers arranged. It takes a full 15 minutes just to get ready for bed, and you haven't even touched the headwear yet. Because of course, you're not done. Not without your nightcap. But that's a whole saga for later. All right, before you get too cozy, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe, but only if your heart says yes. And don't forget, post your location and your local time. I love seeing where and when you're all tuning in from. Dim the lights, get that fan going for some background vibes, and let's chill into tonight's little adventure. Now, let's talk about that nightcap. It's sitting right there on your little bedside table, between a chipped candlestick and the copy of Hints for the Homebound Woman. A cone-shaped bonnet with a trailing tassel, made of cotton or sometimes knitted wool. It looks like something a court jester might wear to a funeral. And yet this was once considered absolutely essential. No one of respectable means went to bed bareheaded. Why? because losing heat from the top of your head was thought to be a direct highway to madness, pneumonia, or death. "You'll leak your health," your aunt once muttered, tying her chin strap tight. It wasn't just an old wives' tale. Even medical guides of the 1840s recommended a close bonnet for all sleepers of nervous disposition. So you put it on. It's tight at first, then slips backward. Then you tug it forward again. The tassel whips your cheek. A loop of ribbon ties under your chin, or in some particularly health-obsessed households, over your mouth, to prevent foul night air from entering as you breathe. Not that it helps. The air in your bedroom is already a cocktail of soot, dampness, and the faintest lingering scent of boiled cabbage from downstairs, and that's assuming you even have a room. Many Victorian tenants shared spaces, often with siblings, elderly parents, or boarders. Privacy was rare, so your nightwear became your only boundary, your armour. These clothes had to shield your modesty when you inevitably passed someone in the hallway on your way to the chamber pot at midnight. Even among the well-off, the ritual was the same. In one recorded household on Gower Street, the entire family lined up before the fire to change into nightwear, each in their own turn, with the rest waiting awkwardly behind a folding screen. If someone took too long, a tap on the screen meant, "Hurry up." Time was precious. Candles were expensive. Warmth was fleeting. Now that you're fully dressed for bed, corseted or capped, wrapped in flannel like a leftover pudding, it's time to actually lie down. But not so fast. Your sheets are rough, linen not yet softened by decades of use. The blankets scratch, not comfort. There's a brick wrapped in flannel tucked by your feet, a foot warmer reheated from the oven below. You think you smell smoke, but it's just the scent of scorched wool. Again, you shift, but your layers bind you. Your armpits itch. The nightcap keeps sliding off. And through it all you lie perfectly still, as if posing for a photograph taken in the dark. Because moving, fidgeting, sweating, those are signs of poor character. A good sleeper sleeps upright, breathes shallowly, and never shows too much ankle when the covers are askew. You blink up at the ceiling. You feel every seam, every button, every itchy stitch that some tired laundress repaired 3 winters ago. This isn't about softness, it's about order, discipline. The right kind of sleepwear isn't for you, it's for society. And in that wool-wrapped stillness, you finally close your eyes, until your sock slips halfway off and gets lost in the sheets. You wake just past midnight with a numb nose and the slow creeping sensation that your ears are frozen. The rest of you might be swaddled in flannel, but your face is exposed to the icy draught sneaking in through the window frame, no matter how tightly it was shut. The fire's long since gone out, the hot brick at your feet has gone cold, and the only thing between your face and hypothermia is your nightcap. You fumble for it in the dark, dragging it back down from where it slid halfway off your scalp. It's heavy with its own moisture now, breath, sweat, and the chill of the room, but it's better than nothing. You retie the ribbon under your chin, this time tighter, and tuck your ears in like you're wrapping a parcel for the post. You look ridiculous, but that's the point. Victorian nightcaps weren't just quaint accessories, they were practically medical devices. Some were made with flannel linings soaked in camphor, believed to ward off rheumatism and congestion. Others had small pouches sewn into the forehead area. Yes, really, to hold a heated coin or medicinal herbs. There was even a short-lived fashion for nose bags, little woolen flaps that drape down from the cap to cover the bridge of your nose, a knit extension of modesty and paranoia. You remember your uncle's cap had a loop at the top to hang it by the hearth during the day. It was thick enough to stand upright on its own. He swore it kept him sane through 12 winters and a bout of lung misery, which was probably just untreated bronchitis. The cap was passed down, mended, and reused until its tassel fell off and the loop snapped. Your aunt wore it next, then your cousin. No one ever dared throw it out. Of course, nightcaps weren't just for warmth. They were a form of social signalling. A lace-trimmed cotton cap with satin ties suggested quiet wealth. A hand-knit, colour-faded one with a droopy bobble meant modest means. Some were adorned with embroidery, monograms, vines, even biblical verses, because heaven forbid you should meet your maker without appropriate stitching. Even the tassel had meaning. In certain circles, tassels to the left implied bachelorhood, while tassels to the right signalled a married sleeper. That could be apocryphal, but it never stopped the neighbourhood boys from teasing one another with the direction of their nightcap flops. Still lying there, you shift again, one eye barely open, and spot a glow beneath the doorframe. Someone else is still awake. Probably your sister, boiling another kettle to reheat her bed warmer. She'll be wearing her own nightcap, of course, likely frilled and embroidered, handed down through 4 aunts and a cousin who died of scarlet fever. Because that's the quiet truth here. Victorian homes were cold, damp, and filled with fears that clung to the walls like mildew. A draught could be fatal. A cold scalp could lead to fever. The body at rest was seen as vulnerable, exposed, morally and medically. And the nightcap, however silly it looks by modern standards, was a shield. Against the chill, against impropriety, against decay. You tug yours lower over your brow. You try to sleep again, and then the tassel slips into your mouth. Morning doesn't come with sunlight in your little room. It comes with footsteps overhead and the rattle of coal being dumped into the scuttle. But you're not ready to rise yet because your nose is frozen again and your ears have that dull ache like you've been slapped by the wind in your sleep. You reach up, groggy, to fix your cap, and there it is. Your own breath trapped beneath the wool, damp and sour, clinging to your upper lip like a fog. You wonder, what exactly were Victorians so afraid of losing through the top of their heads? Some said vital warmth, others believed the head was the gateway through which dreams entered, and nightmares too. There was a whole economy of theories. One 1857 pamphlet even claimed that leaving the scalp exposed after midnight increases one's susceptibility to temptation. You're not entirely sure what that meant, but you suspect the author had a strict upbringing and a poor grasp of anatomy. In richer households, the nightcap evolved into a minor fashion war. Upper-class women wore caps so elaborate they needed help tying them on. Fine muslin, Valenciennes lace, seed pearls along the rim. Some had matching nightgowns embroidered with the family crest. Sleep for these women was still a performance. They didn't just lie down, they retired, and their nightwear was the curtain call. Men were no less vain. Gentlemen of means might own several nightcaps, lightweight for summer, quilted for winter, tasselled for guests. In some cases the caps served to hide thinning hair or an old injury. There's even a caricature from Punch magazine mocking an elderly lord who wore a crimson velvet nightcap to impress his young second wife. But in the poorer quarters, nightcaps weren't optional. They were survival gear. A father might pass his only one down to the youngest child, choosing to sleep bareheaded himself. Mothers knitted caps from leftover yarn, mixing colours that didn't match because matching didn't matter. Warmth did. You remember one old neighbour, Mrs. Ebbing, who wore the same cap for 40 years. It was yellowed beyond recognition, tied with a shoelace, and smelled faintly of coal smoke and lavender. But she claimed it kept the bad dreams out, and no one ever argued with her, especially not after she read fortunes in tea leaves and told you which windows not to look through after dark. There's something deeply human about it, really. The absurd belief that a floppy piece of fabric can shield us from illness, nightmares, judgment, even death. It's not the cap itself, you realise. It's the ritual, the comfort, the routine, the tying of the ribbon, the tuck behind the ears, the smell of the yarn. A tiny gesture against the enormity of cold, of silence, of sleep itself. You lie there a bit longer, the tassel now tickling your cheek instead of your mouth. You give it one final tug, settle back into your musty flannel cocoon, and close your eyes again. And for just a moment, the cap really does make you feel safe. By now you'd think you're finally allowed to drift off in peace. But no, you shift ever so slightly, and your entire cocoon of layers tugs with you. That's because you're not just wearing a nightshirt, you're wearing a system, one that begins with the long wool flannel touching your skin, and ends with a quilted floor-length wrapper draped over everything else, tied at the waist like a bathrobe designed by a committee of monks and corsetteers. This, of course, is the layered bedwear ritual, an art form perfected by middle-class Victorian women who had reputations to protect even in their sleep. In an era where modesty was a virtue and privacy was rare, your nightclothes weren't just pyjamas, they were armour, and armour came in layers. First comes the chemise, the basic cotton underdress worn beneath everything else. It's thin, plain, and slightly stiff from too many washings in lye soap. Over this, a second flannel shift for warmth, and perhaps a loose pair of drawers tied with a ribbon at the waist. The drawers split at the crotch, no buttons or elastic here, just an open design, both practical and awkward. Then there's the overnight gown. You slip into it the way you might a baptismal robe, slowly, cautiously, avoiding twisted seams. It's thick, brushed wool or quilted cotton, with full-length sleeves that puff at the shoulders and gather tightly at the wrists. The weight of it is unmistakable, and it doesn't fall around you so much as collapse onto your frame. If you're from a household with means, this final layer is probably embroidered, your initials near the hem, a discreet floral design at the neckline. A few families even maintained a tradition of sleeping robes as heirlooms, passed from mother to daughter, mended over decades, and worn until the fabric itself felt thin as onion skin. But in modest homes like yours, the outer layer is a bit more functional, patched in 3 places, slightly uneven at the bottom, and fastened with mismatched buttons. 2 wood, 1 bone. It doesn't match anything you own, but it was made by someone who knew what cold feels like in their bones. You pull it closed and tie the waist with a cloth belt. It doesn't cinch, exactly. It bundles, like you're wrapping a sack of potatoes, only the sack is you. You shuffle to your bed in this towering stack of fabric and ease beneath the covers. But there's a problem. Your layers don't move with you. You turn to your side and the wrapper bunches under your hip. You roll back and the inner shift rides up. Adjusting one means wrangling all 3. This is what passes for a comfortable night in a respectable Victorian household. No bare arms, no loosened silhouettes, no scandalous slouching. You are dressed for modesty, not rest. You're wrapped for virtue, not dreams. And heaven forbid someone comes into your room unexpectedly. Because if they do, you'll be seen fully covered, fully decent, and fully exhausted. And yet, despite the discomfort, these layers aren't optional. They're ritual, they're doctrine. Entire chapters in housekeeping manuals were dedicated to what a woman should wear to bed, and how many layers constituted respectable nighttime attire. In the Young Lady's Guide to Moral and Domestic Excellence, a popular 1854 manual, there's a whole paragraph warning against the dangers of sudden exposure during nocturnal emergencies. That's polite Victorian code for don't get caught half-dressed if the house catches fire. So you stay swaddled, not because it feels good, but because it feels correct. That wrapper you're wearing? It's more than warmth, it's insurance. You might need to leave the room to fetch a bed warmer, or check on your younger sibling, or heaven forbid greet a surprise midnight visitor, a travelling cousin, a neighbour bringing news, or the constable delivering a note. All of them might see you, and if they do, It better not be in just your chemise. Even your dreams aren't immune. In Victorian fiction, women are constantly described as stepping from their chambers in flowing white wrappers, or hastily belting their nightgowns before rushing into the hall. Nightwear becomes its own kind of symbolism, purity, propriety and preparedness all bundled into one wrinkled flannel package. But there's another layer, one not made of cloth, the mental layer. See, as the wrapper presses against your ribs and the belt digs slightly into your waist, you begin to sense it, the quiet pressure of being watched. Not literally, but socially, even in the dark, even when no one's around. Because the Victorian night was not private. It was merely dimly lit. And if you're lucky enough to live with a housemaid or a sister who shares your room, you already know the quiet inspection that happens every morning. Did you sleep with your wrapper tied last night? Was your lace flattened? Your belt looks loose. It's not judgmental, not overtly, but it's there. Because dressing for bed was as much about what others imagined of you as how you felt. Some girls even pinned lavender sachets inside the lining of their robes, so they'd smell pleasant if they happened to faint in the hallway. Others carefully arranged their hair beneath their nightcap, wrapping it in ribbons to preserve their curls. And some, particularly the anxious or ambitious, practiced how they'd walk across the drawing room if they ever had to appear in full sleep attire. No detail was unconsidered, no moment unguarded. You sigh under the weight of your layers and the weight of expectation. A button has come undone near your collarbone. You consider fixing it, but then think, what's the point? You're not getting up again. The sheets are scratchy but warm. Your legs are tangled in your own nightdress, but at least that means you're not freezing. You close your eyes and try not to move. Because if you do, one layer will slip, another will ride up, and the entire bedtime ecosystem will have to be rebalanced. And you really, really don't want to start over. You awaken to a dull ache along your spine, not from your mattress, but from the way your nightclothes have bunched beneath you like rebellious upholstery. Shifting doesn't help. Each tug on your wrapper pulls the chemise tighter under your arms. Every time you straighten your legs, the flannel drawers ride up just a little more. By now, it feels like you're sleeping inside a cocoon stitched by an indecisive spider. Welcome to the wonderful world of Victorian flannel combinations, those peculiar one-piece undergarments that promised comfort but delivered only entrapment. Known in polite catalogues as combinations, these suits became increasingly popular by the 1870s, touted as a practical alternative to multiple layers. After all, if you could wear a single woolen garment that covered you from neck to ankle, why bother with chemise, drawers and undershirt separately? At least that was the theory. In practice, you lie here now, stewing in a full-body flannel trap that buttons up the chest, clasps at the wrists and tapers into awkward cuffs at the ankles. The front opens with a line of small pearl buttons, nearly impossible to fasten in the dark. Worse, the back includes a flap secured with mismatched ties, charmingly called a drop seat or a trapdoor. It's not just awkward, it's humiliating. And when it's cold and your hands are stiff, trying to navigate that tiny rear hatch becomes a negotiation with fate. Your great-aunt swore by her combinations, called them my second skin. But hers were tailor-made, stitched in a Surrey shop with softened wool and custom seams. Yours came second-hand from a neighbour's cousin, patched with thread that doesn't match and already missing one elbow. Still, flannel combinations were seen as modern, hygienic, progressive, especially among health reformers who claimed they reduced chill gaps caused by shifting drawers or rising skirts. Some went further, stating that proper undergarment containment would lead to fewer colds, better digestion, and even moral improvement. Yes, once again, Victorians found a way to link underwear to virtue. If that sounds like an exaggeration, Remember that companies like Jaeger built entire empires on the belief that wool clothing worn directly against the skin could cure ailments from fatigue to melancholy. "Live in flannel," one advertisement declared, "and you shall live well. Never mind the itch." You roll to your side, hoping to find a position where the flap doesn't fold against your lower back like a misplaced napkin. No luck. The seams press into your hip bones, and the collar, slightly too tight, rides up every time you exhale. It's less like sleeping in pajamas, more like sleeping in a giant mitten that someone forgot to finish sewing. And yet, you do feel warm. Irritated, yes. Restricted, absolutely. But undeniably warm. And in a bedroom with a cracked window, no insulation, and a fire long since gone cold that might be the only thing that matters. The real trouble comes in the morning. There's a moment just after waking when you attempt to sit up, and the full reality of your flannel combination hits you like a woolen avalanche. Every movement drags against you. The sleeves twist at the elbow, the collar pulls toward your throat, and the backside flap, which somehow shifted sideways in your sleep, is now bunched directly under your hip. You try to stretch, but the fabric tugs back like it's part of the mattress. There is no escape. You are a parcel, and the only one with the string is you. It's no surprise, really. These combinations weren't designed with comfort as a first priority. They were designed with modesty, warmth, and above all, decency. The all-in-one structure was supposed to prevent any unseemly slippage or skin exposure during the night. In theory, they were particularly ideal for young ladies who, according to one 1882 etiquette book, must remain entirely protected during repose, both for her health and her dignity. Dignity is an odd word to apply to a woolen onesie with a buttoned bum flap. You shuffle toward the washstand, which is somehow colder than the floor, trying to peel the layers apart. But your combination clings to your legs like steamed pudding cloth. There's no graceful way out of it. You fumble with the chest buttons, your fingers stiff with cold. Some are missing entirely. One has been replaced by a safety pin, now rusted. You curse under your breath. Not a sinful curse, mind you, just a very Victorian bother this thing. Eventually the whole thing slides off your shoulders and falls in a heap on the floor with a quiet flump. You stand there, shivering in your chemise, blinking in the pale grey light that leaks through the lace curtains. The room smells faintly of damp wool and coal dust. Your breath fogs in the mirror, and here's the twist. Despite the itching, the bunching, the sheer nuisance of that back flap that never sat right, you miss it already. Because without your combinations, the cold creeps in faster. It's in your toes, your neck, the space between your shoulder blades. The very parts your flannel fortress once protected now feel raw and exposed. You're not even outside the covers yet, and you're already wishing you hadn't taken it off. Some nights, you swear your body has adapted to it, like a second skin, or a cocoon. You might hate it while you're wrapped inside, but you fear what happens when it's gone. So you do what every sensible Victorian does. You fold it carefully, damp and all, place it by the fire guard, should someone relight the coals today, and prepare to wear it again tonight. Because despite all its flaws, the flannel combination keeps the night at bay. And in a world where a bad draft might turn into pneumonia, that's enough. You reach for your next layer. The corset comes later, but that's another story. You might think the torment ends there, but no. Now comes the most baffling layer of all, the night corset. Yes, you read that right. As absurd as it sounds to the modern mind, there were women in Victorian England who laced themselves into a special corset specifically for sleeping, and not just a few eccentric aristocrats either. These garments were advertised in women's magazines, sold in department stores, and even recommended by doctors who believed that the body needed constant shaping for long-term moral and physical health. You sit at the edge of your bed now, holding the thing in your hands. It's lighter than a day corset. No stiff steel boning, no tight-laced waist. but it's unmistakably structured. Soft whalebone or cording lines the fabric. The eyelets are reinforced. The ribbon laces are long enough to wrap twice around your back and tie beneath your bust. It's a night corset for gentle training, the box had said, as if your ribcage were a misbehaving child. You slip it on, feeling the cool fabric settle over your flannel chemise. The lining is flannel too, though thinner and more pliable. Some women wore these directly against the skin, but you've learned that flannel on flannel helps reduce the itch. There's no busk in front, just laces up the back, which you manage with fingers half frozen from washing up. You pull gently, then a bit tighter, until your waist feels supported, not strangled. That's the line, after all. Night corsets weren't meant to cinch you into a wasp shape, but they weren't exactly relaxed either. The goal was maintenance, continuity. If you wore a tightly laced corset all day, removing it entirely at night was considered dangerous. Your organs, they said, might shift too rapidly, or your figure might spread. So instead, you swapped one prison for another, only softer. You lie back down, testing the feel. It's snug. Your breath feels higher in your chest. Turning onto your side causes the ribs of the corset to press into your flesh, not painfully, but with a steady insistence. It's like sleeping under a belt made of polite disapproval. But the discomfort isn't just physical, it's philosophical. To sleep in a corset is to admit that your natural body, even in sleep, is unacceptable. You must remain shaped, trimmed, protected from your own softness. There is no moment in the Victorian woman's day when she's allowed to be simply herself. Even unconscious, she is sculpted. You think of your cousin Marianne, who swore she couldn't sleep without her corset, said it gave her spine, the correct sense of direction. She was 15. The corset had been her mother's. The waist was 17 inches. Of course, not all women submitted. Some refused outright. Others compromised with looser, unstructured wrappers. But the pressure was real. Not just from society, but from family, from friends, from doctors. Yes, doctors, who argued that without constant support, a woman's internal organs might sink. You take a breath, shallow but steady. You feel the corset gently resisting, and you close your eyes, knowing that even here, even now, your body is not truly yours. It's not just the corset that shapes your night, it's the weight of everything it represents. You lie still under the covers, spine kept straight by gentle boning, ribs held just snug enough to remind you that rest is something to earn, not simply drift into. And this night corset, though marketed as a comfort item, is still a symbol. It whispers that even in your dreams, you must be delicate, contained, presentable. For many women, especially those of the rising middle class, wearing a night corset was as much about social aspiration as it was about health. Having the correct figure wasn't just vanity, it was your currency. A smooth silhouette increased your chances of a good marriage. A trim waist signalled discipline, self-control and breeding. A woman who woke up laced and ready for breakfast was, in society's eyes, already halfway respectable. That's why mothers encouraged their daughters to start young. Some girls wore their first night corset before puberty. It began as a game, lacing dolls, playing dress-up, giggling at the mirror, but soon it became ritual. Night after night they'd be cinched just so, not too tight, not too loose. Enough to remind the body who was in charge. You remember one dinner at the widow Grimble's house, when her daughter Emma slouched during pudding. "Sleeping without structure, are we?" the widow hissed. Emma turned crimson and didn't look up for the rest of the meal. Not all rebellion was public. Some girls snuck their night corsets under the mattress when their mothers weren't looking. Others loosened the laces after lights out, then quickly retightened them before dawn. A few even replaced their corset with a folded towel. tied snugly under their nightdress to simulate the appearance of discipline. Still, the expectation loomed large. Department stores like Liberty and Debenhams offered entire lines of sleep corsets, some quilted, some decorative, a few even scented with lavender sachets sewn into the lining. They were boxed like gifts and marketed as ideal for new brides, young ladies, or the discreetly aging. You can't help but wonder what dreams passed through those stitched panels. What stories were pressed between those rows of cording? What breathless nights were spent not just dreaming, but enduring? And then there were the quiet tragedies. Stories whispered about women who fainted in their sleep, or woke with bruises along the ribs. Doctors who debated whether these corsets contributed to female weakness or hysteria. One old nurse once told you of a girl who slept every night in a corset left over from her sister's wedding trousseau. She died young of what they called nervous collapse. Whether the corset played a role, no one said. But they buried her in it. You shift slightly. The ribs of your corset creak faintly against the flannel of your chemise. It's not painful, not exactly, but it's always there. A gentle reminder, a quiet shaping, a nocturnal mould, and in the stillness of your small draughty room, beneath 3 blankets and 1 lifeless fire brick, you begin to dream, not of freedom, but of standing upright, perfect, unchanged. You awaken before dawn, not from any sound, but from the slow creeping pressure in your feet. Not pain exactly, just the quiet protest of circulation, interrupted. You tug gently at the covers, trying to relieve the tightness along your legs, and then you remember you fell asleep still wearing your stockings. Silk if you're lucky, wool if you're not. In your case, a mismatched pair, one black, one faded grey, held in place by the tension of your night corset and the unspoken rules of the house. You're not alone in this odd bedtime fashion. In fact, sleeping in stockings was shockingly common in Victorian households, not just in the countryside where stone floors and wind-worn gaps made night air unbearable, but even in London townhouses where coal dust seeped through the wallpaper and fireplaces were mostly decorative after 10 p.m. Victorian logic was painfully clear. Bare skin led to illness, cold ankles, sore throat by morning, bare knees, you'd catch your death. And for women, whose limbs were meant to remain unseen in daylight, keeping them modestly covered at night was just as important, even under 4 blankets and total darkness. You swing your legs slowly over the edge of the bed. The stockings tug against your calves. The wool has bunched slightly behind your knees, forming ridges you'll feel for hours. They were damp when you put them on, never quite dry from yesterday's washing, and now they're stiff from the night's sweat and cold as tombstone moss. You peel one down carefully. It leaves a faint ring of compressed skin and lint. You pause, holding the stocking in your hand. The fabric is frayed near the heel, darned twice, maybe 3 times. You think of your sister sitting by the fire last week, darning needles lined up in a neat row, murmuring about how a lady's ankle should never meet the open air. Not that she'd ever say that in public. These things were understood, not spoken. Part of the quiet instruction every girl learned. Keep warm, keep hidden, keep composed. Some families went further. A friend once told you her aunt sewed sleep garters, soft cloth bands tied around the thighs to hold stockings in place without cutting off blood flow. She claimed they were essential for keeping posture correct during slumber. As if twisted stockings could somehow ruin a girl's prospects by morning. You slip the other stocking off slowly. The skin beneath is clammy. A faint red patch marks where a seam rubbed too tightly. It will itch all day, but you'll still wear them again tonight. Because beneath all the layers and lace, there's something else stitched into Victorian sleepwear. The fear of undoing, of letting the body uncoil, of waking up slack-jawed, tousled and warm-skinned. A proper woman's body, even asleep, was meant to be quietly arranged. You glance toward your wardrobe. Another pair of stockings sits folded on the shelf. They're not much better, coarser, older, but dry. That's something. You'll rotate them in tonight. For now, you rub your feet with your hands, trying to warm them. The fire's still cold, the room's still grey, but the feeling's returning, prickly and slow. And you think, maybe tonight, just for once, you'll sleep bare-legged. Maybe, but of course, you won't. Because as the morning chill sinks in through the floorboards and your toes curl instinctively against the cold, the thought of sleeping without stockings starts to feel foolish, even dangerous. You remember what happened to your neighbour's daughter, the one who caught a chill in her marrow after sneaking her legs bare for one summer night. At least that's how the story goes. She limped for weeks. Besides, stockings aren't just about warmth. They're about containment. They keep the body tidy, quiet, disciplined. And in Victorian sleep culture, that discipline is everything. You reach for your robe and shuffle toward the washstand, every step reminding you of how your calves are still slightly sore from the elastic edge of the garters. There's a faint line around each leg, like a memory of obedience. You splash cold water on your face and glance at your reflection. You look as you always do at this hour, half sleeping, half armoured, wholly proper. By the time breakfast is served, your stockings have dried near the grate. You pull them back on with practiced fingers. This time you bind them looser. Just a little. A compromise. Not that anyone will notice. You'll be dressed from chin to shin, corset back in place, skirts sweeping just above the floor. But you'll know there's a private defiance in softening the edge of a rule. Still, it's easy to forget how these small pieces of clothing shaped a woman's entire sense of self. The gentle pinch of a garter. The subtle tug at the ankle when you walk too fast. The ever-present awareness of fabric against skin, even in the quietest hours of the night. These were the invisible disciplines of the age. It wasn't just women either. Some gentlemen wore wool stockings to bed as well, especially in country homes where damp crept in like ivy through the stone. But for men, nightwear was rarely moralised the way it was for women. A man might wake rumpled and be charming. A woman who did the same was careless, or worse, improper. You think of your younger cousin, Lizzie, who once tore a hole in her only pair of winter stockings. Rather than admit the damage, she cut a square of cloth from her underskirt and sewed a patch beneath the knee. It wasn't perfect, but it passed inspection. When your aunt found out, she praised the thriftiness, but reminded her, gently, that torn stockings were a sign of personal decay, even in sleep, even in private. And yet, you can't help but smile as you press your toes back into the freshly dried wool, because there's something oddly comforting about them now. Familiar, structured, known. They might itch, they might bind, but they are yours. And in a world that so often asks you to fold yourself into silence, a well-worn pair of stockings can feel like a small kind of power. You tie the garters gently, not too tight, just enough to hold, and you think, yes, tonight you'll wear them again. By now you've dressed and undressed yourself in more layers than a wedding cake. You've wrapped, laced, pinned, and tugged. But what happens once you're finally in bed, tucked in, fully layered, face toward the wall with your feet pressed to a lukewarm fire brick? You stop moving. Because in a proper Victorian bed, movement wasn't just discouraged, it was nearly impossible. You lie there now, stiff as a board, under what feels like 40 pounds of bedding. The counterpane, that tightly tucked, elaborately quilted cover, is drawn so close around your body it's almost sealed. Your arms rest at your sides, your legs locked in parallel like you're posing for a sculpture no one will ever see. This isn't an accident. It's the way things were supposed to be. Beds were often made with military precision. Housemaids were trained to tuck the sheets and blankets so tightly that slipping into bed felt more like sliding between book pages than nestling into softness. A well-made bed didn't sag, it resisted. Some girls used to joke that their mattresses were trained to fight back. The joke only works when you've lived it. You shift now, just a little, and feel resistance from every side. Your chemise rides up an inch. The flannel wrapper bunches near your ribs. The corset strains slightly against the quilt's weight. The stockings pull at your calves. The nightcap is barely hanging on. One wrong movement and you'll unravel the entire composition. You stay still. Victorians believed this was the ideal sleeping posture. Supine, still, hands folded or resting softly on the belly, head slightly raised. Moving too much in sleep was considered both a sign of poor health and poor breeding. A restless sleeper, they said, had an undisciplined mind. A lady who slept neatly would wake neatly. And so, you lie there, beneath layers of flannel and expectation, trying not to itch your nose. There's a peculiar comfort in the constraint. It makes you feel safe in a way. Not safe like comfortable, but safe like accounted for, like you're exactly where you should be. Your garments hold you in place, your bed holds the garments, the house holds the bed, and the world, so vast and unpredictable, can't touch you, not here. Of course, there's the added concern of being seen. Beds weren't always private in Victorian homes. Siblings shared rooms, servants shared beds. Guests were sometimes invited to sleep in the same chamber. The idea of sprawling, drooling, or kicking off the covers while someone else watched. Mortifying. That's why women train themselves to sleep like statues, hands in place, legs straight. Face turned slightly in case someone entered with a lamp. The perfect sleeper was practically indistinguishable from the recently deceased. You've seen it yourself. Old portraits of family members laid out for mourning, their bodies arranged as though asleep, and when you look down at yourself now, tucked beneath your counterpane, you realise the pose isn't all that different. You shiver despite the heat. Still, there's something almost peaceful about it. The stillness, the silence, the uniformity of it all. You could be anyone, in any house, in any town, and if you do everything right, if your wrapper stays closed, your cap stays on, and your posture remains respectable, you'll wake up tomorrow just as society expects, perfectly still, perfectly decent, and perfectly unchanged. The hours tick on, but you wouldn't know it. The darkness never quite lifts, and your tightly tucked bedding makes time feel like a rumour. You lie on your back, motionless, the counterpane pressing down on your chest like the hand of a disapproving aunt. You haven't moved in what feels like forever, not because you don't want to, but because you don't dare. It's not just about posture, it's about presentation, even in sleep. Victorian households, especially those with live-in help or shared space, placed enormous value on how one was found in the morning. There are diaries from housemaids describing in exacting detail how their mistresses preferred to be awoken in repose, face serene, cap neat, hands arranged, like one is thinking of a better world. One misaligned blanket, a visible ankle, or, heaven forbid, a snore could be cause for whispers. You remember stories of boarding schools where girls were taught to sleep under inspection. Governesses would make surprise checks after lights out, gently tugging on a sleeve or touching the bed's edge to ensure it hadn't been disturbed. Some girls slept without moving an inch, not from comfort, but from fear of rebuke. And if you think this kind of discipline was only for girls, think again. Victorian boys, especially those in military academies, were also drilled in orderly rest. Some even practiced sleeping with a book balanced on their chest to train themselves not to roll. You shift slightly, just slightly, and immediately regret it. Your chemise tugs beneath your back. One flannel layer has twisted under your hip, and the corset's soft bones creak in protest. Your nightcap slips sideways, the tassel brushing your cheek. You reach up, slowly, carefully, to adjust it, knowing full well that even this tiny act could unravel your perfect repose. But you can't sleep with the tassel in your eye. Once it's fixed, you lie back again, and suddenly you feel aware, too aware, of every seam, every button, every place where the fabric presses just a bit too hard. You think about pulling your legs up, curling to one side, but no, what if the stocking slips? What if the wrapper rides up? What if your sister wakes and sees you tangled, indecent, rumpled? So you breathe, shallowly, quietly, eyes closed, limbs straight. This is the sleep of a society obsessed with order. Not the dreamy collapse of exhaustion, but the slow sinking into place, like returning a figurine to its exact spot on a mantle. And yet, in the stillness, something else begins to settle in. Not just discomfort, but a strange kind of surrender. The tightness becomes familiar. The pressure becomes calming. You begin to understand why people called this posture restful, even when it wasn't. Because there's peace in knowing where everything belongs. The sheets, the nightcap, your very limbs, all tucked in, all assigned. Somewhere beyond the walls the world continues. Fog rolls down the alleyways. Milk carts rattle across cobblestones. Coalmen call out to back doors. But here, under your tightly folded layers, you remain untouched, preserved. A quiet artifact beneath embroidered cotton and Victorian caution. But not everyone slept like a statue in flannel and lace. Somewhere across town, far from your stiff sheets and scratchy wool, another kind of sleeper stirs, one who isn't tucked under a counterpane, but sprawled out in an airy cotton tunic. No corset, no trapdoor, and certainly no nightcap. They're wearing something new, something foreign, something whispered about in tea parlours and side-glanced in dress shops. Pyjamas. Yes, that's what they're called now. Pyjamas, a word borrowed from Hindi, pajama, meaning leg garments, and just like tea and pepper and printed cotton, they came to Victorian Britain through the back door of empire. You lie back, bundled in your layers, and imagine it. A loose drawstring trouser, flowing and light, paired with a matching tunic. Not flannel, not wool, just plain cotton, cool, crisp, and scandalously comfortable. Pyjamas were first adopted by British officers stationed in India during the Raj. They were practical, easy to wash, and merciful in the heat. When these officers returned to England, some brought their sleepwear with them, quietly at first, privately. It was seen as exotic, foreign, even improper for an Englishman to wear a native garment to bed. But times change. By the 1870s, a few London tailors began offering continental sleeping suits, styled loosely after Indian pyjamas but tailored for British tastes. At first, only bachelors and eccentric travellers wore them, then artists, then doctors, and eventually, quietly, men of standing began to order custom sets, striped silks, ivory buttons, monogrammed pockets. You remember hearing about one such man, Mr. Langley, a cousin of a friend, who dared to wear pyjamas during a country house weekend. He arrived late to breakfast, dressing gown open, linen pyjamas visible beneath. The hostess was mortified. Her husband asked in a too loud voice whether Mr. Langley had forgotten his drawers. The room went silent. But then, 3 weeks later, the hostess's nephew ordered a pair. That's how fashion moves in Victorian England, not in leaps, but in whispers. First scandal, then imitation. For women, pyjamas took longer, much longer. The idea of a lady wearing trousers to bed was nearly unthinkable in 19th century England. Even bloomers, introduced decades earlier as a form of rational dress, were ridiculed into near extinction. Trousers on women were tied to suffragists, radicals and foreigners, not the sort of company a respectable girl kept. But behind closed doors, some women tried them. Quietly. Secretly. Especially those who had lived abroad, or who had French governesses with a taste for the unorthodox. You'd heard rumours of one such woman, a widow who wore men's pyjamas in her private rooms and claimed they cured her rheumatism. No corset, no stays, no tangled drawers, just cotton and ease. In your own house, of course, such a garment is unheard of. Your father once described pyjamas as fancy paper sacks, for rogues and dreamers. You've never seen a pair, but tonight, as your limbs ache beneath layers of wool and your nightcap itches your temples, you imagine it, just for a moment. You let yourself picture the way the cotton would slide over your legs like a breeze, and you wonder, what would it feel like to sleep without apology? But imagination only goes so far in a house like yours. You stir under the counterpane, the friction of flannel tugging at your nightdress, and the pyjamas vanish. You're back in your bed, your corset pressing gently against your ribs, your stocking still laced neatly behind the knees. Pyjamas might exist in the world, in the illustrated pages of travel memoirs or the whispered lives of unmarried doctors, but in your bedroom they are as distant as the Bengal tiger. Still, the idea lingers. You remember an article you once read, slipped inside an old Harper's Bazaar, about the increasing infiltration of Eastern comfort into Western bedrooms. It showed a sketch of a gentleman reclining in striped silk pyjamas, feet bare, sipping something herbal in a porcelain cup. He looked outrageous and terribly at ease. That same magazine claimed that pyjamas would replace the cumbersome nightshirt by the turn of the century. The line felt bold, almost dangerous. You clipped it out and hid it under your writing box, never daring to mention it aloud. What made them so different, really? The answer isn't just fabric, it's freedom. Pyjamas flow. They don't cinch. They don't layer. They don't carry the weight of lineage, of sermons, of a dozen aunts reminding you to tie your wrapper higher, dear. They're foreign, yes, but they're empty of judgment. There's something quietly radical about a garment that asks nothing of your waistline or your modesty. Of course, not everyone saw them that way. There were sermons, pamphlets, and editorial pieces in polite papers warning against the creeping orientalization of domestic life. One reverend in Bath wrote that pyjamas encouraged idleness and dreams of godless ease, which you'll admit sounded rather lovely. Still, the vast majority of Victorians clung to their nightshirts, and not without reason. Pyjamas were expensive. Imported at first, then custom-made by brave tailors. They weren't readily available, especially outside of London, and for most women they remained locked behind glass display windows labelled "for gentlemen only." Yet now, lying stiff in your layers, you can't help but shift ever so slightly beneath the counterpane, letting the image return. A lightweight top with loose sleeves, no corset, a waistband that ties instead of buttons, no back flap, no endless strings, just cloth against skin, cloth that breathes. It doesn't matter that you'll never wear them, not here, not now. What matters is the idea that somewhere someone is sleeping without the ache of a waiststay or the press of flannel seams against their thighs. The coal in the grate is burned to ash. The air is still. Your room smells faintly of lavender soap and old wool. You lie quietly, imagining pyjamas, not as a fashion, but as a possibility. And in that vision, soft and absurd and wonderfully foreign, you finally fall asleep. Not because you're comfortable, but because, at last, you're dreaming something different. Morning returns like a damp rag pressed to the cheek, grey, heavy and without ceremony. You sit upright, rubbing sleep from your eyes, the edges of your nightcap sagging sideways like a deflated soufflé. Every layer you slept in has twisted in rebellion. The corset's a little off-centre, your stockings have bunched around your calves, and the flannel chemise is sticking to your back. The dream of pyjamas is long gone. But if you were a Victorian gentleman, things might be a little different, not simpler necessarily, just more luxurious. Because now we enter the curious, competitive, and sometimes absurd world of men's nightwear, where gowns had names, robes had reputations, and a man's bedtime wardrobe could rival his daytime suit in splendour. You picture it. A tall man standing before his hearth, the fire low, his sleeves velvet, his slippers embroidered. He's not in a nightshirt. Oh no! He's in a robe de chambre, also called a dressing gown, though this particular one is lined in silk and has hand-knotted tassels that would make a bishop jealous. These weren't just garments, they were statements. A man's dressing gown was part comfort, part theatre. Some were quilted for warmth, others imported from France or Turkey, made from paisley silk, damask, or even oriental brocade. There were striped ones for lounging, dark wool for modesty, and crimson velvet for men who fancied themselves philosophers or poets, or at least wanted to look like one before bed. And yes, they were often worn over nightshirts. But in richer households, the dressing gown became the main event. Men dined in them, received guests in them, and even had portraits painted wearing them. Why not? It said, "I'm at home, and still better dressed than you'll ever be. You've seen one before, in a painting at your uncle's townhouse." The gentleman sits in a wing-back chair, legs crossed, holding a letter with the seal half broken. The gown drapes over the arm of the chair like a waterfall. You don't remember his name, only the red silk lapels. Even middle-class men adopted their own version. Theirs might be made of wool or thick cotton, but still trimmed in tasteful braid. A gentleman might not afford a coach, but he could certainly afford an imposing bedtime silhouette. There was, of course, etiquette to this. Robes were not pyjamas. You didn't sleep in them. You wore them before and after. They were for the liminal hours, dressing, undressing, perhaps a bit of reading or brandy by the fire. To wear your robe too late in the morning implied laziness. To wear it too early in the evening suggested you were eager to escape your trousers. Still, some men grew attached. One elderly barrister was rumoured to have amended his will to include instructions for his robe to be passed down to the most literary of my nephews. Another commissioned a second, identical robe, just so he'd never be without it during washing days. And beneath the robe, well, that's where things got more complicated. Beneath the robe, a gentleman's bedtime attire could range from the utterly simple to the flamboyantly ridiculous. At the most basic, you had the nightshirt, a long loose tunic made from linen or cotton, often plain white and reaching to the knees or mid-calf. But for those with means and imagination, even this humble garment became a canvas. Some men had nightshirts embroidered with their initials, just above the breast, or at the hem where only the most observant might notice. Others commissioned French cuffs, trimmed in lace or delicate blue stitching. A few went so far as to add monogrammed buttons, though everyone knew they'd likely pop off in the wash by year's end. You picture a man in his 30s, gently balding, standing before his mirror with a candle flickering in one hand, adjusting the fall of his nightshirt as if preparing for an audience. He smooths the front, straightens the collar. The whole performance is absurd, but not to him. He's dressing for the quiet dignity of sleep. Because make no mistake, a gentleman's nightwear was serious business. The way one appeared after hours mattered more than most would admit. Servants saw you. Family saw you. If you were travelling, fellow guests might glimpse you along the corridor. There were stories, yes, real stories, of marriage proposals beginning not in ballrooms, but in those twilight hallway crossings, robe to robe, slipper to slipper. You remember hearing one tale of a dandy who slept in Egyptian cotton trimmed with navy velvet. He claimed it helped him dream in colour. Another kept a wardrobe of sleeping costumes, a different one for each day of the week, each with themed embroidery. Birds on Wednesday, constellations on Saturday, hunting dogs on Monday. He once told a guest, "The mind sleeps better when the body is properly dressed for its journey." Of course, not all of it was harmless eccentricity. Some nightwear became a weapon of class distinction. A butler in an upscale Mayfair home once noted in his journal how his master changed into a fresh nightshirt twice each evening, once before dinner in the dressing gown and again before bed, just to avoid the appearance of using common cloth. Imagine the laundry. Still, there was a comfort to it all. Ritual, predictability. The robe, draped just so. The slippers warming by the hearth. The rustle of linen as you poured a small glass of port and read a passage of Gibbon or Pope. The fire dimming as you tied the final sash. And then, when the world grew still and the candles burned low, you'd slip off the robe, fold it carefully at the foot of the bed, and slide beneath the sheets with the practised grace of a man who'd done this exact performance for 20 years. You weren't wearing pyjamas, no, but you were dressed exactly right for the time, the place, and the image you wanted to cast. Because even in slumber, the Victorian gentleman never truly undressed. But what of the smallest sleepers? The nursery, with its faint scent of chalk, milk and damp wool, had its own dress code. A different universe of buttons, belts and bedtime bindings. If you thought adults were tightly wrapped in the name of modesty, comfort and health, wait until you step into the nightwear rituals of Victorian children. It begins with a nightgown. For most children, this meant a long, straight cotton shift, sometimes bleached, often hand-me-down, nearly always oversized. It hung from shoulders to ankles and was rarely fitted, so as to accommodate growth spurts, shared use, and the inevitability of accidents. The material was usually coarse. Softer fabrics were reserved for the wealthier households or the sickly. But the garment itself was only the foundation. Over it came the sleeping belt, a cloth sash or sometimes a stitched cord tied around the waist, meant to keep the gown in place, preserve warmth, and discourage unseemly movements in the night. You can still hear your old nurse's voice. Tidy child, tidy dreams. And that's not just poetic nonsense. Victorians genuinely believed that a well-dressed child was more likely to grow into a well-behaved adult. The bedtime routine was part hygiene, part discipline, part silent sermon. Parents inspected nightwear before bed, checked hems, sniffed collars. Children were expected to stand still as they were buttoned, belted and blessed. Even toddlers weren't exempt. Infant nightclothes were often pin-closed instead of tied. Safer, they said, though many children still ended up scratched by their own safety pins. There were also sleeping bands meant to encourage correct posture by preventing babies from rolling. Imagine a padded strip tied across the stomach, affixed to the mattress beneath. That was bedtime safety. And in colder homes, it didn't stop at the nightgown. Children were sometimes wrapped in flannel binders, woolen bands wound around the torso under or over the gown to prevent chills. In some places, particularly in Scotland and northern towns, families added knitted foot bags or separate woolen leggings, tiny flannel sausages laced with ribbon. But not all of it was cosy. Some families, especially among the reform-minded Victorians, believed that too much warmth spoiled a child's constitution. These children were put to bed with windows cracked, arms exposed, nightgowns thin as cheesecloth. a sort of character building by chill. If they woke shivering, they were told to breathe through it. You remember one boy from school, Arthur, with the large ears and blue knuckles, who once said he hadn't worn a wool layer to bed since infancy. His father believed in tempered lungs. Arthur coughed through every winter and still failed Latin. But for others, bedtime was ceremony. A nursemaid might warm the bricks, smooth the sheets, brush the child's hair until it shone like oiled rope. The final ribbon tied around the nightcap signalled that all was right. That childhood, for all its terrors, was at least contained. Contained, that's the word. Because the goal of Victorian child nightwear wasn't simply warmth or modesty, it was containment, of limbs, of dreams, of desires. The tighter the flannel, the quieter the child. The silence of the nursery is deceptive, because even while the house sleeps, children's nightwear tells its own story. One of little rebellions stitched between the seams. You remember it yourself, don't you? The tickle of the sash against your ribs, the scratch of wool at your neck, the slow agony of lying perfectly still beneath a too heavy blanket while your toes searched for the one warm spot left by the fire brick. And yet, there was something sacred about it. In families with money, children's nightgowns were sometimes edged in lace or embroidered with their initials. Girls might have ribbons stitched into the collar or cap sleeves with tiny shell buttons. Boys wore gowns too, but with straighter lines, fewer frills. Their nightgowns came with stern names like junior rest robe or sanitary sleep tunic. In more practical homes, there were no such niceties. Your gown came from an older sibling. It was already faded, already patched, already shaped by someone else's sleep, and you wore it anyway. Because you knew the rules, because you understood that nightwear wasn't really about comfort, it was about order. Sometimes that order went a step further. There were families, especially among the pious or the paranoid, who used nighttime restraints, gentle of course, cloth mittens to prevent thumb sucking, straps sewn into the hem of the gown to discourage leg movement, special sleep jackets that buttoned in the back, ensuring the child couldn't remove it during the night. It wasn't cruelty. It was, they said, guidance, protecting the body from bad habits, teaching the soul to lie still. One particularly grim pamphlet claimed that a child trained to rest without tossing shall grow into a man of fixed convictions. You suspect the author never met a real child. And then there were the shared beds, not out of affection, but necessity. 3 children, 1 straw mattress, 1 blanket. No privacy, no space to fidget. If one kicked, all 3 woke. So they learned to lie quiet, to hold still, to wait for dawn without complaint. Your friend Henry once told you he'd shared a bed with his twin until they were 11. His brother snored. Henry learned to sleep with his face turned the other way, hands folded, breath held just long enough to slip into dreams without noticing the noise. But for all its restrictions, there was a strange beauty in it too. The moment when the nurse dimmed the lamp, the smell of lavender water dabbed at the temples, the warmth of flannel, thin though it was, and the soft click of the final button before the world went dark. Because in those tightly wrapped limbs, in that cold room, in that scratchy gown 2 sizes too big, you felt something that still lingers now. Security, not softness, no, not ease, but the feeling that someone cared enough to wrap you in rules, and even if your arms tingled, even if the cap itched, even if the belt left a line around your waist that stayed until morning, you still remember how safe it felt to be contained, to be wrapped, to be known. Now picture this. It's the middle of the night, and there's a soft knock on the door. Maybe it's the maid, or maybe a neighbour with urgent news, or perhaps a child with a nightmare, eyes wide in the dim hallway. Either way, you have to rise, and be seen. That's when your nightshirt becomes your calling card. Because in the Victorian world, even being caught in your sleepwear was a social occasion. The nightshirt hierarchy wasn't written in books, but everyone understood it. A plain white nightshirt of coarse linen marked you as working class. A fine cotton one with a subtle blue stripe, middle class, aspirational. Add French seams, lace edging, or initials embroidered in red thread, and suddenly you were respectable, perhaps even refined. These weren't just bedtime clothes, they were signifiers. You rise from bed now, pulling your wrapper tighter, but the real judgment lies beneath it. That nightshirt you're wearing, it speaks before you do. Too short and it's indecent. Too long and it looks like a shroud. If it's stained or torn, people will assume the same of your morals. If it's too new, you're showing off. If it's borrowed, heaven help you. In wealthier households, guests even brought their own nightshirts when visiting. Monogrammed, neatly pressed, scented with rosewater or cedar. One hostess in Kensington reportedly dismissed a guest from breakfast after catching sight of his wretched flannel smock when he stepped into the corridor. She later sent him a fresh set from Harrods, with compliments. It wasn't just about fashion, it was about values, cleanliness, modesty, control, and above all the belief that even in the most vulnerable state, half asleep, tousle-haired, barefoot, you should still appear as a person of order. Men were judged on the cut and quality of their nightshirts, women on the delicacy and concealment. There were nightshirts with pin tucks down the chest, or tiny pearl buttons at the collar. In France, some had pleated ruffles at the cuffs. In England, this was seen as dangerously frivolous. A well-bred Englishman wore his nightshirt like his morals, straight, unadorned, and just stiff enough to make sitting up in bed slightly uncomfortable. You remember seeing your uncle's nightshirt once, folded neatly at the foot of his guest bed, white as chalk and starched like a napkin. It had his initials, WBC, stitched in navy thread just above the hem. No one ever saw it but family, and yet he had it cleaned and pressed weekly, without fail. Even among the poor, distinctions were made. A hand-me-down shirt with worn elbows might still be laundered, dried by the hearth, and laid out with care. Because the condition of your nightshirt wasn't just about sleep, it was about how you rose, how you met the morning, how you answered that midnight knock. So now, as you step quietly into the corridor, wrapper drawn close, nightshirt rustling beneath, you don't think about comfort. You think about impression. You think about the hem just brushing your ankle, and whether that faint stain near the cuff looks more like tea or ink. And still, for all its quiet symbolism, the Victorian nightshirt rarely drew open praise. No one complimented a man's sleeve length at the breakfast table. No lady whispered about the linen weave in her neighbour's sleeping garments. But beneath that silence was a well-oiled machine of judgment, recognition, and unspoken expectations. You sit back on the edge of your bed now, the chill of the wooden floor biting at your heels, nightshirt brushing your shins. It's a simple thing, really, just fabric with sleeves and a hem. But it carries a weight no cotton should bear. Think of the laundry, the starching, the pressing, the mending of seams and careful folding. There were homes with entire weeks built around wash days, and the nightshirt was never exempt. Even servants had designated shirts for Sunday night, clean sleep to begin a new week. Even the poor, when luck allowed, had a best shirt, kept in a drawer, only worn for company or when lodging with strangers. And then there were the wedding nightshirts, stitched from fine lawn or cambric, adorned modestly with lace or soft ribbon. A new bride might embroider her initials in secret, or leave a faint scent of lavender inside the collar. These nightshirts were less about sleep and more about ritual, the quiet crossing from one life into another. Not all nightshirts were white either. blue stripes emerged late in the century, signalling a faint nod to practicality. Dirt hid better in pattern. A few fashionable gentlemen favoured faint greys or pastel tones, but always in muted, respectable hues. Anything too bold, colourful, flamboyant, foreign risked raising eyebrows. As always, a man's nightwear was a measure of restraint, not imagination. Some families kept records, yes, literal ledgers, of household garments, when they were purchased, washed, repaired, retired. Your cousin once showed you her grandmother's linen book, each page listing gowns, drawers, underskirts, and yes, nightshirts, noted in iron gall ink. Removed to rag drawer Septi 1862, hem too worn for mending. Even in death the nightshirt played a role. Many were buried in them, especially the poor who had no funeral dress, laid to rest in the same garment they had lived their quiet, unadorned nights in. One final sleep in the most familiar fabric of all. And here you are, still alive, still in yours. It's not pristine. There's a fray at the collar, a faint tear at the underarm, and that mysterious stain you've never quite identified. But it fits. It knows you. It's been moulded by your breath, your turning limbs, your nights of sweat and shivering. It isn't beautiful, but it is honest. You slip back beneath the covers, the nightshirt settling around you like a sigh. No buttons to fuss with, no stays to tighten, just you and cloth, and the gentle rustle of someone else sleeping in the next room. And before your thoughts wander too far, you're already drifting again, held not in fashion, but in familiarity. There's a box beneath the bed. You've seen it since childhood. A squat, cedar-lined chest with tarnished hinges and a stubborn lid. Inside, neatly folded stacks of something once considered precious. Not gold, not lace, not letters, but flannel. To a modern eye, it's just fabric. But to a Victorian household, it was salvation. This is the age of health flannel, after all. A fabric that didn't just warm you, it protected you. Doctors recommended it. Advertisers praised it. Housewives hoarded it. And for decades, an entire industry boomed around the belief that wool, soft, brushed, properly washed wool, could keep you not just warm, but well. You reach under your bed now and pull out one of the older pieces. It's beige leaning yellow, loosely woven, the edges worn to fringe. A laundry mark stitched faintly in the corner. A.W. 1873. It's your great-aunt's. The family always said she wore flannel from neck to knee, even in July. Claimed it kept her rheumatism and regrets at bay. And she wasn't alone. Victorians believed in the healing power of wool with near-religious conviction, not just for outerwear, but against the skin, under every other layer, and yes, even in bed. Nightshirts, drawers, chest wraps, socks, undervests, and especially those strange flannel bands tied around the abdomen. Why? Because it was thought that a warm stomach meant a healthy body. Medical journals of the era backed it up. One Dr. to G.H. Weatherby wrote in 1868 that a sudden chill to the abdomen is the origin of more mischief in the British Isles than drink, damp, or despair. He advocated flannel next to the flesh at all times, particularly during sleep, when the body was at its most vulnerable, and so people obeyed. You recall a neighbour who slept with her flannel socks pulled over her nightgown cuffs, another who had a flannel-lined pillowcase for the spine, a schoolmistress who claimed flannel underwear cured her winter melancholy, and was known to change hers only once a month with ceremony. This wasn't laziness, it was loyalty. Wool was trusted, cotton was risky, silk was vain, but flannel was moral. It clung without seduction, insulated without pride. It was the fabric of conscience. Even advertisements played into the gospel. Jaeger, the famed manufacturer of sanitary woolen system clothing, printed ads declaring that their undergarments could prevent tuberculosis, improve the liver, and enhance mental clarity. One boldly claimed, "Flannel beneath is virtue within." You can't help but smile at that. Somewhere, buried under decades of mothballs and coal soot, that sentence probably made sense. Still, the faith in flannel wasn't just about health. It was about control. With so much about Victorian life unpredictable, sickness, weather, politics, grief, wrapping the body in something known, something proven, felt like taking back a measure of safety, like turning chaos into comfort. And so, as you hold the flannel nightshirt to your cheek, scratchy and stubborn as ever, you begin to understand why people kept them long after they frayed. Because it wasn't about softness, it was about survival. The flannel, when you fold it back, leaves a faint warmth in your hands, more imagined than real. But that's the thing about health flannel. It wasn't just fabric, it was belief, stitched into wool. Not everyone bought into it, of course. There were skeptics, doctors who raised eyebrows, reformers who scoffed. But even they couldn't deny the numbers. Flannel sold by the mile. Entire catalogues were dedicated to it. Not just for clothing, but for everything that touched the body. Sheets, pillow covers, mattress linings, even bed curtains. One pamphlet recommended sewing a square of flannel inside your bonnet to preserve warmth of mind as well as head. There were even flannel masks. Yes, face covers for sleep, designed to trap warmth and prevent toothaches. Some looked like something between a bandage and a beekeeper's veil. Others came with stitched flaps for the ears, the nose, or even the throat. One company in Manchester patented a flannel respirator that promised to cure snoring and heartbreak, though perhaps not at the same time, and yet the public lapped it up. Because in an era of mystery illnesses, weak constitutions and sudden deaths, who wouldn't cling to a material that promised immunity? Your cousin once had a full flannel sleeping set made. Drawers, undershirt, vest, socks, and even gloves. He wore them through 2 winters and claimed he never once sneezed. He also never once smiled, but no one connected the two. You lie back now, wrapped in your own patchwork flannel gown, and feel the weight of it settle. It's heavier than cotton, less forgiving than silk, but it holds you with a kind of earnest stubbornness, like a nurse who disapproves of noise, or a grandmother who doesn't believe in rest until your feet are covered. Of course, health flannel wasn't just about bodies, it bled into the moral imagination. Flannel was respectable. To sleep without it, especially in winter, was seen by some as not just unwise, but indecent. There were sermons on the perils of indulgence, where going to bed without flannel became a metaphor for slipping into sin, and those who resisted, they were whispered about. You remember one girl, bright, wild, full of jokes, who refused to wear hers, said it made her feel like a potato in a sack. Her mother wept. Her schoolmistress warned her. By spring she had a cough. People nodded. Of course she did. The flannel had warned them. But others quietly tested boundaries. Some cut the sleeves shorter, some trimmed the waist. A few brave women hemmed their flannel nightgowns to mid-calf and told no one. The material remained, but the rules began to fray. Because in the end, flannel might have promised health, but what it really gave was control. Control over the air, the temperature, the body. Control over the chaos of night. You pull the blankets higher. The wool scratches, the ribbon pinches, the seams press into your collarbone, and yet you sleep. Not because it's soft, but because in this stiff old gown, you're exactly who they hoped you would be. Warm, modest, silent. But what lies beneath the warmth and stitching of Victorian nightwear isn't just fabric or even health. It's decency, or at least the performance of it. Because here's the unspoken truth of the age. Victorians feared not just illness, but impropriety, and nowhere was that more fiercely defended than in the realm of sleep. You're lying in bed now, still as a painted angel, flannel nightgown tucked beneath your chin, feet covered, breath shallow. Not because anyone is watching, but because someone might. The house is quiet, but the rules are not. Everything about what you wear to bed has been designed to keep your body in check. The gown must reach your ankles, the sleeves must cover your wrists, the neckline should never dip low, even in private. You're a silhouette, nothing more. You've seen the books, of course, the guides to modest living, with chapters on proper bedside conduct and guarding the soul at rest. They warned against rising from bed uncovered, against opening doors before fastening the wrapper, against sitting near windows in only a nightgown. Even the act of walking in sleepwear required grace and restraint. And these weren't just niceties, they were moral armour. For women especially, bedtime was never a time off. It was simply another arena for discipline. The fact that you wore a corset beneath your wrapper said something. That your cap was tied neatly before sleep said something. That your slippers matched said everything. After all, what if there was a fire? What if you had to evacuate? What if a neighbour came to call with urgent news at dawn? Would you be found improper? There's the famous case of Mrs. Halberton, found standing in her front garden at midnight having mistaken a dream for a summons. The constable said her attire was alarming in its informality. Her nightgown slightly wrinkled, her feet bare, her wrapper unbuttoned. She never lived it down. Moved to Cheltenham within the month, so you dress with the fire drill in mind, the knock at the door, the way a hemline might be judged in an emergency. Because in the Victorian imagination, decency wasn't what you did when people were watching. It was what you wore when they weren't. Even married couples had standards. Many slept apart, or at least dressed separately. A lady might don her flannel gown in one room, then cross quietly to her shared bed, already buttoned and belted. The idea of appearing exposed, even to one's spouse, was enough to make women weep in confession. You recall overhearing your aunt say she hadn't let her husband see her ankles in daylight since their wedding night. And that was 32 years ago. Of course, the enforcement of all this varied. In more liberal households, women might allow themselves lace-edged collars or silk-trimmed sleeves. But even these small indulgences were carefully framed as elegance, not exposure. A glimpse of wealth, not of skin. Because skin, even the whisper of, it was dangerous, even in the dark, even in sleep. You lie there now, motionless beneath your quilts, thinking not of warmth, but of your invisibility. Your flannel gown conceals everything. Your nightcap shadows your hair. Your hands are folded, your toes tucked, your breath shallow and even. You've become, by design, modest beyond reproach. But modesty in Victorian nightwear wasn't just about coverage. It was about containment, not just of the body, but of emotion, imagination, desire. And it touched every corner of sleep. Take, for instance, the great taboo, sharing a bed. For the unmarried this was unthinkable, unless you were siblings or small children, or travellers at an inn where space forced compromise. Even then, precautions were taken. Nightclothes buttoned higher, wrappers belted tighter, eye contact avoided, breaths held. For married couples the matter was trickier. Many households, especially among the middle and upper classes, maintained separate sleeping arrangements. Not out of coldness, but out of correctness. Husbands and wives might retire together but sleep in separate beds, even separate rooms. A lady's chamber was her sanctuary, and it included her dressing, her undressing, and her carefully composed sleep. And if they did share a bed, there was still the unspoken understanding. Intimacy was allowed, briefly, politely, and only with the correct lead-in. But sleep? Sleep was separate. The body must return to its rapt, silent state. There's an old saying, a gentleman turns before the candle is blown out, meaning he gives his wife privacy to arrange her nightgown, tighten her wrapper, slip into stillness. Even passion bowed to propriety. You recall reading a housekeeping manual that offered advice for married women. If retiring in the presence of one's husband, she must remain fully adorned in her sleeping attire, including slippers and cap, until his attention is clearly turned elsewhere. Imagine the choreography of it, the planning, the careful awareness of angles, collars, fasteners. Nothing slipped, nothing revealed. Even disrobing was an act of discipline. And what if the rules were broken? There are letters, half-hushed, half-hearted, in which women express deep guilt for having appeared undone before others. A cousin who forgot her wrapper during a late-night illness. A neighbour who rushed outside during a chimney fire with her nightgown flapping improperly in the wind. These incidents weren't shrugged off. They were carried, sometimes for years. Because for Victorians, especially women, modesty wasn't just a matter of dignity. It was your reputation woven in thread. You feel it now, in the way your wrapper tightens when you roll to your side, in the quiet discipline of lying flat until dawn, in the fact that every inch of you, from collarbone to ankle, is sheathed in a nightgown meant to leave nothing of you behind. And yet, in all that covering, you feel something else, invisibility. No one sees the body beneath the linen. No one imagines its movements, its shape, its restlessness. You are orderly. You are composed. You're the very picture of restraint. But underneath that flannel, your lungs still rise. And somewhere in that stillness, something quietly longs to breathe. But now let's leave the bedroom of the pious and the proper. Let's open a creaking door just down the lane, past the gaslight flickering in the fog, and step into a chamber lined with books, brandy decanters, and a velvet settee that has never once seen a pair of tidy slippers. Because here, in the shadowed corners of Victorian society, lives a man of a different sort altogether. A dandy, a bachelor, a collector of silks, scents, and long, slow evenings. And his nightwear? Oh, it tells an entirely different story. You've heard rumours, everyone has, of the gentleman who owns 5 dressing gowns, one for each mood, of another who wears lavender cravat ties to bed to ensure softness of thought, of men who sleep in imported Chinese robes, quilted slippers, monogram nightshirts with cuffs so wide they must be tied to avoid knocking over the lamp, and you always thought, surely not. Until one day, visiting a cousin in the West End, you saw it with your own eyes. A room faintly lit, rug plush beneath your shoes, and there by the fire, a man in a nightrobe that shimmered like oil. Deep green silk piped in black, with a belt knotted artfully at the hip. No flannel, no starch, no shame. The scent of Turkish tobacco hung in the air. He offered you tea in a silver cup. This wasn't just bedtime attire, it was theatre. And for some Victorian men, especially the urbane, unmarried or gently scandalous nightwear became a performance of self, a way to claim the dark hours as one's own. When day demanded collars and rules, night allowed velvet and excess. Where others stiffened into cotton armour, these men unfurled like drapery. Even the writers joined in. Oscar Wilde famously wore velvet dressing gowns as daytime attire, but his nighttime wardrobe was no less intentional. Letters mention crimson robes, peacock blue slippers, and a shirt so fine it offends the night. He wasn't alone. Poets, painters, and unmarried lawyers with book-lined studies all took cues from this culture of midnight elegance. And there were shops for it. Discreet tailors along Piccadilly and Bond Street sold evening comforts made of imported satin and jacquard weave, Some catalogues featured illustrations of men reclining on chaises in gold-embroidered robes, cradling pipes, eyes half closed. The message was clear. To sleep like this is to live differently. Of course, not everyone approved. The magazine sniffed. Ministers warned. One pamphlet from 1885 called the trend a corruption of masculine integrity, a slouching towards softness. Another claimed that such robes weakened the moral spine. And yet, the market thrived. Because these robes weren't just about sleep. They were about independence. You imagine it now. The gentle swish of silk as he walks across the rug. The way the lamplight catches his cuff. The slippers that never leave the floor. And the pipe that never quite goes out. It's indulgent, yes. But it's also controlled, precise. Just another form of discipline, draped instead of buttoned. And as you sit in your own flannel wrap, suddenly aware of your stiff collar and scratchy seams, you begin to wonder, what would it be like to dress for the night as if it belonged to you? You close your eyes and picture it, rising from your desk as the clock strikes 11, the city outside hushed beneath fog and gaslight. You remove your collar, your waistcoat, your boots, and instead of reaching for flannel and fuss and pins, you shrug on something luxurious. A robe, not just warm but deliberate. Not armour, but art. Because that's what the Victorian dandy understood. That sleep was not just the end of a day, it was an extension of identity. The night robe became his canvas, rich silks in sapphire or plum, quilted linings, braided trims, some even had custom embroidery, quotes stitched along the hem, family crests reimagined in gold thread. One eccentric solicitor had the phrase, "mild by moonlight," sewn into the collar. No one ever asked what it meant, and underneath, sometimes a fine lawn nightshirt, sometimes nothing at all. Dandies played with the line between structure and surrender, knowing full well that too much modesty was just as vulgar as none at all. In these chambers the rules softened. A man might entertain close friends by lamplight, reciting poetry in bare feet and a velvet robe. He might pour a final drink, adjust the tassel on his sash, and lean against the mantel with the confidence of someone completely at home in their skin. But not everything was play. This nightwear, ornate, expressive, a touch scandalous, was often the only place a man could be himself. In a society that demanded starch and duty and buttoned mouths, the robe was freedom wrapped in silk. It allowed softness, privacy, style without scrutiny. And of course, not all who wore such robes were dandies or radicals. Some were simply lonely, widowers who dressed up for no one, scholars who kept the habit for routine, gentlemen who, in old age, found comfort in the familiar swish of satin. You once visited a bookseller who, though nearly blind, insisted on wearing his green velvet robe every evening. He couldn't see the threads, but he remembered them. Remembered what it felt like to dress with care, even for a quiet night among old papers and older thoughts. And perhaps that's the point. Because beneath all the embroidery and imported silk, what these night robes offered was something your flannel wrap never quite could. Permission. Permission to be warm and visible, comfortable and expressive, to carry dignity into the dark, not by hiding yourself, but by choosing what version of you the darkness would hold. You shift now under your blankets, your wrapper bunched at your waist. The tie is twisted again, and your elbow is caught in a fold. You sigh. The flannel is dutiful but never graceful, and you think, not for the first time, how strange it is that the night, the most private, peaceful, intimate time, was so often spent disguised. Maybe tomorrow you'll visit the old cloth shop on the corner, just to look, just to run your hand over something that shimmers, just to wonder, a what if. But let's pull the velvet curtain back now, and descend, not into silks and solitude, but into something far colder, far closer to the bones of the city. Because not everyone in Victorian England had the luxury of wrapping themselves in robes or tucking into lavender-scented sheets. Just a few streets away from the gentleman's parlour, behind the cracked shutters of a narrow tenement, someone else is preparing for bed, if you can call it that. A factory girl, a laundress, a young scullery maid too tired to speak, and what she sleeps in, what she wore all day. There's no separate nightgown hanging behind the door, no wrapper, no slippers, just a threadbare dress, a stained undershift, and a pair of stockings rolled carefully beneath a straw-stuffed bolster to keep mice from chewing them overnight. This is the nightwear of the working poor. Not so much sleepwear as what's left. The line between day and night, rest and labour, is as thin as the seams on her only chemise. You sit now on a shared cot, maybe with a younger sister or a cousin, knees tucked to your chest, trying to preserve body heat. The room smells of soot, boiled onions and damp wool. A single candle flickers on the crate you use as a table. The windows are covered with a bit of flour sack nailed across the frame. And what do you wear to bed? Everything you own. A patched wool shawl wrapped tight over your shoulders, a skirt still stiff from the day's weather. If you're lucky, a man's cast-off vest, stolen from the rag bin and refitted with string. Your feet are cold. Always. Some women tuck their legs into old potato sacks. Others slept with bricks, not the carefully warmed ones of the middle class, but leftover building bricks, still dusty, wrapped in rags. One laundress you knew tied an old apron around her ankles every night just to keep her feet together and warm. And yet even here, even in hardship, the impulse to dress for bed didn't vanish. You might brush your hair twice. You might rinse your face with cold water if there's any left in the jug. You might even tie a bit of ribbon around your braid, not because anyone will see it, but because the ribbon is yours, and the braid makes you feel like yourself again. There's a dignity in that, a kind of sleeping pride passed between sisters and whispers. Always fold your dress, even if the floor is wet. Turn your stockings inside out so they dry by morning. Don't cry into your only pillow. It'll smell sour for days. And above all, don't let them think you've given up. Even in a nightdress made from a flour sack. Even when there is no nightdress at all. You lie down slowly now. Not into a bed, but into a corner of borrowed space. The mattress is thin, the blanket is damp, and the air bites. Your back brushes the wall, cool and flaking. Your knees pull in toward your chest and your elbows wrap tightly across your middle. There's no comfort to be found here, only habit. Your nightwear isn't really nightwear at all. It's what's left at the end of the day, what hasn't been ruined by soot or taken by the pawn shop or passed down to a younger child. Sometimes it's an old coat worn inside out. Sometimes a man's discarded shirt, too big at the collar and too tight at the wrists. You don't choose what you wear to sleep, you simply use it. And yet, even here, sleep has rules. In the kitchens and servants' quarters you've learned them well. Never sleep with your laces tied. Never hang your chemise too close to the fire. It'll burn in silence, and no one will notice until morning. Always keep your shawl near the wall side to block the cold, and never, ever snore. It draws attention. And attention is the last thing you want when sleeping in a house that isn't yours. Some girls stuff rags between their toes to keep the chill away. Others share warmth, back to back, breath to breath. You've done it yourself with cousins, co-workers, even near strangers. The intimacy doesn't matter. You sleep out of necessity, and necessity is patient. It teaches you how to ignore smell, scratch, and shame. There's a phrase you once heard from an older washerwoman. At night, we vanish. And in a way, it's true, because the night doesn't forgive poverty. It simply swallows it. Still, even the poorest rooms carry rituals. A girl might sleep in her Sunday dress if it's the only clean garment she owns. Another might lay a cracked mirror by her pallet, so she can wake and see herself as something other than invisible. You once saw a child smooth her skirt before curling up under a stairwell. No pillow, no blanket, just a skirt and a moment of quiet defiance. Even men, when they could, tried to preserve order. A pair of boots lined against the wall, a cap hung neatly, a waistcoat folded under the head for a makeshift cushion. These weren't luxuries. They were fragments of self-respect smuggled into sleep, and in all of it, you sensed something both heartbreaking and resilient. That even in rags, even in cold, even on a floor shared with 6 others, people still wanted to dress for the end of the day. Not just out of routine, but out of the need to hold on to identity, however threadbare. You close your eyes now, shawl pulled tight, skirt still damp from the day's work. There's no softness, no fire brick, no wool-lined cap. But there is a quiet, steady breath. Yours. And in this moment, even dressed in someone else's discarded shirt, you have claimed the only thing the day couldn't take, your dignity. Now shift your weight, just slightly, and imagine a door slamming behind you. Not the creak of a tenement or the hush of a nursery, but the heavy, final thud of iron on stone. Because tonight, you don't sleep in a home at all. You sleep in a prison, or a workhouse, or maybe the back ward of a charity hospital, somewhere behind locked gates where nightwear isn't a matter of taste or class or even comfort, but a matter of regulation. This is institutional sleep, and your clothes, what little there are, belong not to you, but to the system. You're handed a chemise, plain and stiff, issued from a cupboard that smells of lye and mildew. It's been worn before, dozens of times, stamped with a number, bleached beyond colour. You turn it over in your hands and feel the seams already fraying, the collar coarsened by too many washings. No lace, no ribbon, no warmth. You're told to remove your own clothes, everything, and fold them into the canvas sack labelled with your assigned number. You're not allowed to keep your stockings or your cap or the comb in your pocket. Those go into storage for return on discharge, they say, though you know not everyone makes it that far. You step into the chemise. It hangs shapeless, like a bell around your knees. The neck is too high, the armholes too tight. You can't tell whether it was meant for a man or a woman, because here, such distinctions don't matter. Only uniformity does. In the prison dormitories, everyone sleeps in rows of iron beds, each with the same grey blanket, the same straw mattress, the same rusted frame. You lie down, your hands folded on your chest because that's what's expected. No turning, no whispering, no coughing unless you want the matron's glare. And in the workhouses it's worse. There's no privacy, no fire, no possessions. You sleep not to rest, but to reset. Ready to wake at dawn and scrub floors, sew shirts, crack stones. Nightwear here isn't meant to comfort. It's meant to erase. Even the language strips you. You're not you. You're inmate Nagfortevn, or worker third class. Your gown doesn't protect your modesty. It declares your status, a single layer of thin cotton, easily inspected, impossible to hide in. Hospitals offer slightly more mercy. There you might get a wool blanket, a thicker chemise, maybe even slippers if your feet are bandaged. But even in charity wards, clothing must be uniform, washable, impersonal. Each garment is designed to reduce the patient to the illness, not the individual. There's a quiet pain in that. Because no matter what brought you here, a crime, a cough, a collapse, you must surrender not only your name, but your nightwear. That deeply personal layer, that strange comfort, that last claim to identity, replaced with a grey, unmarked smock. And so, as you lie back now beneath a blanket that smells faintly of carbolic and cold metal, you close your eyes knowing that you are no longer dressed for sleep. You're dressed to disappear. The night stretches out long in the workhouse. There are no clocks in the sleeping quarters, just the muffled steps of the warden on the tiles and the sharp call of bells if someone dares cough too loudly or shift too often. Sleep comes not as a gift, but as a sentence. Your limbs ache, not just from the hard cot beneath you, but from the awareness of being watched. The matron walks past each bed, her shoes clicking rhythmically like a metronome for obedience. You dare not move. Even in sleepwear, if you can call this limp smock wear, your posture must obey. This is nightwear designed for surveillance, loose enough to inspect injuries, short enough to prevent hiding things. No belts, no pockets. The kind of garment that folds flat so hundreds can be laundered at once. It serves the institution, not the sleeper. And still, the human mind resists. You see it sometimes in the small rebellions. A prisoner tying a scrap of string around her wrist like a bracelet, or someone sleeping with their blanket pulled in a way that mimics a mother's shawl. In hospital wards, dying women might request their own nightgown brought from home. A final mercy, if their family can afford to fetch it. A nurse might allow a patient to keep a handkerchief under the pillow, unwashed, faintly perfumed. Tiny things, but monumental, because even in these harshest of nights, people try to dress themselves with fragments of selfhood, to make the cold linen a little warmer by memory alone. You think now of one story whispered among the laundry girls, a woman in a debtor's prison who embroidered her number into her issued nightgown, but in pink thread, stolen from a mending basket. Just one letter, just one flourish. But it was hers. Of course she was punished. The gown was burned. But the other girls remembered. They remembered because nightwear is never truly neutral. Even when assigned, even when stripped of style, it carries the scent of the one who wears it, the fear, the hope, the longing. And though the systems tried to standardize sleep, they never quite succeeded. You hear the woman in the bed beside you murmur a prayer. One across the aisle clutches a lump of cloth like a doll. The blankets rustle. Someone shifts and sighs. The night continues, heavy and impersonal. But under every smock, a heart still beats. Every breath warms the fabric just enough to claim it, even here, even now. In the darkest halls, beneath numbered sheets, people are still people. You're not in a prison tonight. You're not in a mansion either. You're somewhere in between, on the move, tucked in a jolting carriage or curled near the hearth of a coaching inn, wrapped in a coat that still smells faintly of horses and fog. Because tonight's sleep isn't domestic at all. It's travelwear turned nightwear, and it has its own strange rules. You arrive late, after dusk. The road has been long, the coach stiff, and your spine feels like it's been rattled by every stone between Bath and Canterbury. Your bonnet tilts at a strange angle. Your gloves are stiff with dust. But what you notice most is how the others begin to prepare for bed without undressing. In the common room of a posting inn, the fire glows low and travellers shuffle awkwardly, unwrapping scarves, loosening collars, but never quite revealing anything beneath. That's the first rule of sleeping on the road in Victorian England. Modesty must survive fatigue. You slip off your overcoat, fold it into a cushion and keep your boots on, just unlaced. You dare not remove too much. You never know if you'll need to flee in the night or if a stranger might pass through your corner. In second-class inns, the walls are thin and the locks are laughable. Instead of a nightgown, you wear what you travelled in. A riding habit, perhaps. Thick wool, buttoned high. A skirt that holds its shape even while lying down. It itches, but it guards. And tonight, guarding is more important than sleeping. For the wealthier sort, a travelling wrapper might be unfurled. A long quilted robe meant for modesty during late arrivals. Some even had hidden pockets sewn into the lining, for coins or a pistol. It's not lace-trimmed or delicate like a nightdress. It's more like armour with embroidery. And for gentlemen, there's the infamous travelling banyan, a loose Eastern-style robe, fashionable among poets and professors. Worn over trousers and a shirt, it could serve as loungewear, sleepwear and smoking jacket in one. You might have seen one draped over the knees of a man scribbling by candlelight, the silk worn thin at the elbows. But not everyone had robes or banyans. Some simply wrapped themselves in blankets, coat still buttoned, hat pulled low, on the floor, on a bench, or on straw, whichever was free. And that's the curious part. When the road became your bedroom, clothes weren't just clothes, they were barriers. Between your body and the cold, between yourself and others, between safety and exposure. The fire crackles. A man snores upright in the corner. A child curls beneath a horse blanket. Someone nearby shifts with a sigh, then coughs into their shawl. No one truly sleeps, not deeply. But in this moment, swaddled in the stiffness of your own travel-stained garments, you pretend. You pretend this coat is a comforter, that your gloves are mittens, that the fire's glow means safety. And for a few breaths, it almost works. You don't wake up in a bed. You wake up half upright, neck aching, your cheek pressed to the cold window pane of a creaking coach. The morning fog hasn't lifted, and neither has the ache in your spine. Your cloak is damp where it gathered under you. One glove is missing, and the heel of your boot is crusted with hay. You shift stiffly, blinking. The innkeeper's boy clatters past with buckets of water, sloshing your reality back into place. You slept in your clothes. Again. This was normal. For many Victorians, particularly the working classes, travel didn't come with the luxury of a private room or wardrobe changes. Most country inns offered shared beds. In some rougher taverns you paid for half a bed. The turn-in system, where you'd climb in beside a stranger and hope they faced the other way. If you were lucky, the bed sheets were warm. If unlucky, they were crawling, with lice, with bedbugs, with the trace scents of a dozen strangers. So many travellers, especially women, refused to undress. Their nightwear was their daywear again, just crumpled and defensive. To make it slightly more tolerable, some carried portable nightwear tucked deep in their travel trunks. A linen shift, a flannel petticoat, even a pair of night slippers. But only if they could afford the space. Every inch mattered when journeying by cart or coach, and nightwear was often sacrificed for extra stockings or food. One curious solution, especially among travelling tradesmen, was the use of sleeping belts, a woolen band wrapped tightly around the lower back or stomach to prevent chills while sleeping upright. Not a proper garment, but a useful trick to keep the body warm without shedding your main clothes. Think of it as a heated waistband, with none of the heat. Then there were the railway sleepers, introduced in the latter half of the century. A miracle for some, a nightmare for others. In the cheaper compartments, passengers dozed on benches curled in cloaks, while wealthier travellers reclined in padded compartments with folding washstands and privacy curtains. Still, even the poshest railway travellers rarely changed into true night clothes. Instead, they relied on their dressing gowns, slippers and travel caps, items just refined enough to imply rest, but not so informal as to suggest complete vulnerability. And if you were part of a travelling troupe, a musician, an actor, a nurse moving between towns, you might end the night sleeping backstage or in the attic of a kind stranger's home. There too, your costume, uniform or overcoat became your blanket. The line between sleepwear and outerwear blurred, until the only real difference was whether your eyes were open. So as you settle back into your stiff travelling layers, maybe resting your head on your satchel, you realise that Victorian travel didn't just bend the rules of sleep, it bent the very definition of what sleepwear was. You weren't dressing for dreams, you were dressing for survival on the road. You wake up with the sea in your ears. Not waves exactly, more like the thick groan of wood, rope and distant shouting. The air is damp and sharp, salt clings to your sleeves. Somewhere nearby, someone is retching into a bucket. Tonight, you're not in a manor or an inn, you're not even on land. You're sleeping in the belly of a Victorian ship, and your nightwear, well, that depends on who you are. If you're a sailor, there's no nightwear to speak of. You wear what you work in: loose canvas trousers, a sweat-stained undershirt, a tarpaulin coat folded under your head. Maybe, if you're lucky, you've kicked off your boots and wrapped your feet in old flannel. But you don't undress. You wouldn't dare. The call to deck could come any moment, and if you're sleeping in a hammock as most seamen did, you've mastered the art of folding yourself into swaying fabric while fully clothed. The hammock rises with your breath and rocks with the ship. There's a rhythm to it. Sleep in sync with the sea, but it's never deep, and it's never long. You sleep in fragments, like the wind. Officers fare better. A cabin, a cot, perhaps even a dressing gown, monogrammed and perfumed with lavender satchels hung to fight off mildew. But even they dress cautiously. The sea is unforgiving. No one wants to be caught in embroidered slippers during a storm. Women, when they're on board, have it worse. In steerage or emigrant quarters, they sleep fully clothed, corsets loosened but rarely removed. It's cold, it's crowded. Privacy is a myth. So the shawl becomes the nightgown, the bonnet becomes a shield. You sleep curled around your satchel, your name stitched into your apron in case you're lost overboard. But for the wealthiest travellers on transatlantic liners, those bound for New York or Calcutta, nightwear becomes something of a statement again. Silk robes, nightcaps trimmed with lace. Cabin stewards bring hot water, and some women insist on changing into full dressing gowns and embroidered slippers, pretending the ocean isn't heaving beneath them. Still, even in the finest cabins, things fall apart. A storm hits. The wardrobe tumbles, a slipper rolls across the floor, and suddenly the silk robe feels absurd. You brace yourself against the frame of your bed, nightwear clinging damply to your back, and realise the sea doesn't care what you're wearing. You remember a story one sailor told about a cook who always wore the same greasy flannel at night, until a wave knocked him from his hammock. They found him hours later, tangled in rope, one foot bare, the other still in a cracked wooden clog. No one ever saw him sleep in anything else again. On ships, nightwear is a lie of stability. You cling to it. You mimic comfort. But deep down you know, at any moment, the sea might take it all. The ship creaks louder in the dark. You hear it in your bones now, a slow, splintering moan that feels older than time itself. Someone above. You paces the deck in heavy boots. A rope snaps taut with a sudden jerk. The lantern flickers, and below all that noise, the hush of breathing, a dozen other souls trying to sleep beside you in cramped swaying rows. There is no bedroom here. Just narrow berths and swaying hammocks, or if you're steerage, plank boards laid side by side with barely a foot of space between you and the next poor dreamer. So you wrap your coat tighter, you fold your cap over your eyes, and you hold your breath every time the ship leans too far to the left. Among the migrants, those who sold everything for passage, nightwear was rarely owned, let alone packed. It was extra weight, extra fabric, a non-essential in the brutal arithmetic of crossing an ocean. So people slept in the same clothes they'd worn for weeks, bodices loosened, collars unbuttoned, layers rewrapped, but never fully removed. And if someone did have a nightgown, it was often homemade, cut from sackcloth or flour bags, dyed faintly with tea to look more modest. Some women embroidered tiny flowers on the hem, just to keep a little softness near their skin. But those touches were quiet rebellions, not norms. The real norm was hard sleep, disrupted, rank with smells of bilge water, engine grease, sour feet, and seasick breath. In winter, your hair might freeze against the wood. In summer, you'd wake drenched and pressed against strangers. And always, always, you clung to your bundle, whatever you owned, sewn into a skirt lining or stashed beneath a petticoat. Even wealth didn't insulate fully. On some upper-class voyages, you'd find yourself invited to deck promenades in evening wear, but then asked to don a specific kind of nightshirt made of flannel to discourage passengers from sleeping too long so they'd stay presentable for breakfast. Yes, your nightwear was policed, even at sea. Some eccentric gentlemen brought fur-lined sleeping cloaks, designed to keep them warm in icy cabins. Others packed collapsible canvas tents to place over their bed like a child's fort, meant to protect against miasmas. On one notorious Arctic expedition, a naval officer insisted on wearing his mother's quilted nightgown each night for moral fortitude. He died in it, preserved in ice. So when you close your eyes now, shivering, your collar sticking to your neck, you're part of a long line of wanderers and fools who tried to make comfort on a floating plank. You pull your scarf tighter and wonder, not what time it is, but what time it'll be when you next feel warmth. Nightwear on a ship is not about dreams, it's about denial, about the stubborn hope that you might make it through this night without waking up wet, cold, or nowhere at all. The sea sighs beneath you. You do not sleep, you drift. You don't hear the door open, but you feel it. A breath of cooler air, a hush of expectation, and the sound of someone quietly drawing the curtains. You blink against the low candlelight. You're not on a ship anymore. You're not in an inn, or a coach, or a workhouse. You're in a hospital, and you're about to discover one of the most unusual kinds of Victorian nightwear ever stitched. Designed not for comfort, not for modesty, not even for sleep, but for control. It starts with the fabric, thin, pale, sometimes coarse calico, sometimes old linen donated by charitable ladies who had no idea their embroidered tablecloths would be turned into restraint gowns. These garments were issued to patients in asylums and infirmaries, often in poor condition, sometimes blood-stained or patched beyond recognition. And they weren't really worn, they were put on like a command. If you were considered agitated, restless, or hysterical, you might be dressed in a nightgown stitched shut at the back, with the sleeves tied to keep your arms close to your sides. In more extreme cases, the sleeves themselves were sewn long, crossed over the chest and tied behind the back, an early form of what we now call the straitjacket. Only this one had lace on the collar. Many patients never changed. You wore the same institutional gown day after day, night after night, regardless of your needs or the weather. In some places, records show patients wore a single gown for over 2 months. You slept in it, sweated in it, cried in it. It became your second skin. Nightwear in Victorian hospitals wasn't chosen, it was assigned. Sometimes by rank, sometimes by diagnosis. A convalescent recovering from pneumonia might receive a softer cotton shift and an extra woolen shawl. But someone with epilepsy or melancholia, likely downgraded to coarse calico, sometimes even issued without undergarments, to make supervision easier. You begin to notice the details now, the way the gown pulls at your shoulders when you move, the faint iron tang of the bed frame, the identical rows of narrow iron beds with their peeling green paint and creaking springs. The nurse who walks past carries no lamp, only a tin basin and a weary expression. Not all hospital nightwear was cruel. In some charitable hospitals, especially toward the end of the century, reformers insisted on embroidered initials, monogrammed bed linens and matching slippers, believing that decency and recovery went hand in hand. But for the poor, or the mentally ill, nightclothes were more about control than comfort. And heaven help you if you lost your gown. Inmates who tore or soiled theirs were sometimes left naked overnight as punishment. Others were sewn into theirs, literally. A practice in some rural asylums involves stitching patients into their gowns at bedtime and unpicking the thread in the morning. Fewer disturbances that way, less wandering, less talking. So tonight, as you lie back in your rigid bed, arms restricted by design, your bare feet pressing against the chill iron of the frame, you don't feel dressed for rest. You feel like you've been dressed to disappear. You shift slightly, and the stiff cotton scratches your shoulder. The neckline is too high. The sleeves bunch beneath your arms. The whole gown smells faintly of starch, bleach, and something sour that never quite washes out. You try to pull your knees toward your chest, but the fabric catches, tight across the thighs. That's the point. Movement discouraged, modesty enforced. You're not alone in this ward. Around you, other patients breathe in unison, though none of them speak. Their faces are turned to the wall. Some stare at the ceiling. One woman whispers to herself, rocking gently, her hospital gown worn threadbare at the elbows. You've noticed the gowns aren't all the same. Some are hand-stitched, uneven. Others bear small symbols, crossed keys, initials, a stitched daisy, signs left by older generations of nurses or by the patients themselves when they were still allowed needle and thread. One man wears a version with a wide collar and a loop sewn onto the back. The loop, you've heard, was sometimes used to hang patients' gowns on hooks during bathing, or worse, to drag them when they refused to walk. And then there are the bed gowns of the dying, thinner, looser, easier to remove. In some almshouses and county infirmaries, patients near death were issued a special nightgown, usually pale blue or white, with wide cuffs and a neck that could be opened easily for last rites, even though the priests had long stopped coming. These were sometimes referred to by staff as departure gowns. No one liked being put into one. Everyone knew what it meant. But even in the bleakest places, odd little comforts crept in. A nurse might leave a sprig of lavender in the pocket. A younger patient might embroider a secret letter inside the hem. In one London asylum, a reform-minded matron insisted on letting patients choose their own nightgown from a linen cupboard, saying it gave them a sense of personhood, however fleeting. Of course, that didn't last. Budgets shrank. Rules returned. And the gowns went back to being what they were always meant to be, a uniform, a barrier, a way of separating those who belonged from those who didn't. You turn your head on the thin pillow and stare at the ceiling. There's a spiderweb in the corner. Someone coughs. You feel the cold metal frame beneath your spine. You wonder what time it is. Not in hours, but in days. How long have you been here? When was the last time you wore your own clothes? And then you remember the story they told about the patient who stitched a full map of the Yorkshire coast inside her hospital gown. 1 square inch of embroidery at a time. No one noticed until they cut it off her before burial. She never left the hospital, but her gown held the outline of the sea. You close your eyes. The fabric stiffens as it dries against your skin. There is no comfort here. Only the distant memory of what comfort used to be. And somehow that's enough to help you drift. You wake up in silence. Not from the noise of a bell or a nurse's steps or a cock crowing through an open window, but from a different kind of stillness. The kind that only happens inside a Victorian deathbed, and not just any bed. You've been placed in a mourning chamber, though no one calls it that aloud. The wallpaper is darker here, burgundy velvet or funereal green, depending on the household's taste. Heavy curtains block the morning light. The air is thick with beeswax polish, old roses and camphor. The bedclothes are pristine, the sheets are crisp, and what you're wearing, well, that's the part you weren't expecting. You're in what some Victorians called a last sleep gown. The material is fine, better than you're used to. Bleached muslin or brushed cotton with pearl buttons and delicate pin tucks across the chest. It's long, nearly to your ankles, with wide sleeves that billow slightly when you move your arms. There's lace at the cuffs, maybe a small stitched cross at the collar, if your family still follows the old traditions. But don't be fooled. This isn't about elegance, it's about symbolism. Victorian mourning culture had rules for the living, yes. Black crepe dresses, jet jewellery and etiquette manuals thicker than Bibles. But there were also rules for the dead. You didn't just pass away, you dressed for it. And in the days before embalming became widespread, your nightwear became your shroud. This final night dress wasn't bought from a shop. It was prepared in advance, often by the wearer herself. A girl might sew it at 17 and keep it folded in lavender until her 60s. Some women hemmed them into the back of linen closets, tucked behind bridal gowns or baby clothes. Others embroidered initials into the hem, or lines of psalm, or a tiny dove with outstretched wings. There's a strange intimacy in it, choosing what you'll wear to leave the world. In poorer households, the last sleep gown was plain but clean, white or ecru. In some rural parishes, it was passed down through generations. And in workhouses, it was often issued from a communal chest, labelled only by size. But wealth brought its own rituals. In some Victorian aristocratic homes, the nightgown worn for death was dyed grey or mauve, matching the mourning palette. It might be adorned with Valenciennes lace or a silk sash. And, here's the strange part, some families hired seamstresses specifically to create these gowns from a person's wedding dress. You lie there now, the fabric smooth and quiet against your skin. Your hands are folded neatly over your stomach. You feel the weight of the room pressing inward. Not grief, exactly, but expectation. A maid has lit a candle on the small table beside you. A mourning wreath hangs on the door. And your gown. Your gown rustles faintly when you breathe. You're dressed not to rest, not to be comforted, but to be seen one last time. There's a stillness to this final garment that nothing else matches. Unlike the flannel nightshirts of cold December nights, or the hospital gowns that chafed your shoulders raw, this nightdress feels suspended in time, not made for tossing or sweating or waking, only for lying still. Someone, somewhere, has tied a ribbon at your throat, not tight, just enough to suggest closure, dignity, as if the body were a book that needed binding for its final chapter. You feel the linen shroud beneath your shoulders, its faint starch rustling against the clean mattress ticking. The sheets have been turned with care, with corners tucked neat enough to please any Victorian housekeeper. The air smells of soap, beeswax, and the faint sharpness of vinegar used to scrub the floorboards. Downstairs the house has gone quiet. Clocks have been muffled with cloth, mirrors veiled. A strip of black crepe has been hung on the door. These aren't theatrical gestures, they're customs. For the Victorians, death was a dress rehearsal and a performance all at once, and nightwear played a central role. There were rules about the feet, bare for children, socks for the elderly, slippers for the genteel. In some regions, women were laid out with a prayer book sewn into the hem of their nightgown. Others wore a cross pinned inside, close to the skin, so that only the departed and God would know. It wasn't always quiet. If you'd passed away in a city tenement, you might be swaddled in whatever was clean, a borrowed shift, a neighbour's extra apron. In fever hospitals, gowns were burned and replaced by hastily cut lengths of calico. But in homes like this, a proper last gown was a point of pride, a sign that you had, as the Victorians would say, died a good death. The candle on the bedside flickers, A shutter creaks softly in the wind, and as the light wanes you begin to see not just the room, but the long parade of garments that brought you here. The corset-loosened chemises, the tea-stained sleeves of shared servant bunks, the stitched tight sleeves of restraint, the felted flannels of winter nights, and now, this. One final gown. You can almost hear them rustling behind you, those ghosts of nightwear past. Not frightening, just present. A cotton echo of lives lived and slept and dreamed in layers of fabric, and for a moment you feel a strange warmth in your chest. Not fear, not cold, just the deep knowledge that in this world of soot and starch and stitching, you too had a place, even if it was just marked by a row of tiny mother-of-pearl buttons down the centre of a gown meant for the end. The candle goes out, and for once you sleep without dreaming. Let's slow things down now. You've drifted through dim hallways, flickering candles, scratchy flannel hems, and silken sleeves drawn for ceremonies no one speaks of anymore. You've lain in freezing servants' quarters, endured the starched creak of asylum gowns, and floated in the hush of final resting wear. But now, the night no longer presses in, the edges of the world soften, the cotton grows lighter, the buttons looser, the silence that once carried weight now carries warmth. Whatever you've worn, whether rough homespun or fine lawn, whether you were stitched into it by necessity or custom, it was never really about the fabric, was it? It was about the stories folded into the seams, the quiet rebellions embroidered into hems, the comfort hidden in the creases, and as your breath grows slower, you can almost feel the gentlest version of it all. A soft, clean gown, warm from the hearth, slipped over your shoulders by someone who once cared for you, when the world was smaller and kinder and the dark wasn't quite so cold. The wind outside may whistle, and distant footsteps may creak, but here, in this moment, you are held. There is nothing left to wear, nothing left to carry, only sleep,